Rape, not just a woman's issue, a human issue. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Law Essentials welcomes you to the 24th edition of the webinar on human rights and rape. Rape is the fourth most common crime against women in India. As per the latest government data released on September 29, 2020, India recorded an average of 87 rape cases daily in 2019, a rise of over 7% from 2018. A total of 32,033 cases of rape were lodged in 2019, which was 7.3% of all crimes against women during the year, the data showed. Rape is a serious problem in India. Today we have with us Mr. Falakyar Askari, advocate at the Patna High Court. He has completed his LLB from NLU Assam. He is the founding president of the NGO Law for Aid and Welfare, which has been continuously working at the grassroots level to bring about the change from within. He has launched the Know Your Rights campaign, which will organize legal awareness sessions at educational institutions, slums in the cities, village, and such other places where one can capture in the common masses, both educated and uneducated. He has also established a center for women empowerment. Thank you so much for joining here with us today, sir. It's been a pleasure to host the event.
I'm indeed pleased that I have an opportunity to be amidst all of you. It's just that it seems that my camera isn't working well, and it goes off and off every time I switch it on. So I seek an apology for this.
I would request you to start off with this session, sir.
Right. So before I begin with this session, I have a few things to state. And that is while we are to be talking about human rights and rape victims, I think it would not be possible that, in a duration of just 60 minutes, we are able to cover everything. And I've therefore planned it slightly differently and would request that, we take up and have another session as well. But of course, today I might not be continuing for as long as 1 hour. The reason is because the topic is very sensitive and requires much, uh, you know, uh, uh, it requires a delving into it with much sensitivity. Uh, Before I commence, however, I would take all of your leave to read a couple of paragraphs from a wonderful book that I came across very recently by one Sohaila Abdullali. Sohaila Abdullali was the first Indian survivor to speak about rape. She is presently based in New York, of course, and she was gang raped as a teenager in Bombay. And indignant at the deafening silence on the issue in India, she wrote an article for Women's Magazine questioning how we perceive rape and rape victims. She saw her story go viral after almost 30 years in the year 2012 when we saw the massive upheaval in the backdrop of Delhi gang rape case of a lady. The Nirbhaya matter, as it is very popularly known as. So I'll read a part from it. I'll read the first paragraph. She writes, rape drains the light. Like J.K. Rowling's fantastically terrifying Dementors, it sucks joy. And along with draining the light from victims' lives, it tends to drain the light from sensible conversation. Now, this is very important. Discussions about rape are so often irrational and sometimes outright bizarre. It's the only crime to which people respond by wanting to lock up the victims. It's the only crime that is so bad that victims are supposed to be destroyed beyond repair by it, but simultaneously not so bad that the men who do it should be treated like other criminals. I want to let some light back in. You see the kind of emotions that she has put into it. and very rightly brought to us one of the most important questions, and that is the uh, attitude towards an issue like rape, where the victim herself stands victimized over and over again, but seldom are questions raised on the perpetrators. So therefore, a rape takes place and then we forget about it, and then there is a massive uproar only the next time we hear of something of that kind. I'll read another paragraph, and that should be the last paragraph that I'll be reading from this book. She writes, I'll be interested to see which shelves this book ends up on in bookstores. Essays, not really. Sociology, not learned or academic enough. Psychology, no, too opinionated. Research, not comprehensive enough. Memoir, I hope not. It's easy to say what this book isn't because it doesn't neatly fit into any genre. This is just what I want because in this space lies my freedom. I can do whatever I want, and I have. I can roam around the world and the internet, stopping where I want, chatting with whoever takes my fancy, and drawing my own conclusions or not. I'm very willing to take shameless advantage of my street cred as a rape survivor to generalize and opine. But I speak only for myself, not for anybody else. So we see the kind of passion with which this lady has written and the kind of courage that she has been able to knit around a certain thing that betook her some time back. And we see that she herself is very confused, and rightly so. Even I do not know as to which category should this book fall into. And therefore, before we further delve into the issue of rape, we need to be talking about what human rights are, especially with respect to victims of sexual violence. But over and apart, it is important that we have an independent judiciary. You must be wondering as to delving from, I'm hopping from one topic to another. But at the end, we'll see how all of these are deeply interconnected. The existence and validity of human rights, Albert Einstein had once said, are not written in the stars. I believe that these ideals and convictions which result from historical experience, from the carving for harmony, or for that matter, beauty, these have been readily accepted in theory by man. And at all times, they have been trampled upon by the same people who have accepted this. A large part of history, therefore, is replete with the struggle for human rights. We see it. It is an eternal struggle, I would say. And the final victory, I mean, as soon as I joined practice in the year 2016, I realized perhaps can never be won. In fact, at the end of 1 week, I was left so disillusioned with the court practice and the way things work, especially the lower courts, trial courts, that at one point in time I considered that I should leave practice and get into academics. But it was only because of God's grace that I continued to stick with it. And hence this conclusion that perhaps this is an eternal struggle in which there can be no final victory. In talking about human rights today, we refer primarily to the following demands. I've enlisted them. protection of individual against arbitrary infringement by other individuals or by the government, the right to work and to adequate earnings from work, freedom of discussion and teaching, adequate participation of the individual in the formation of his government, and so on. These human rights nowadays, though recognized theoretically, and of course by the use of abundant formalistic legal maneuvers, are being violated at each and every step. And I can most certainly say, though it may not be politically correct to say, that these are being violated to a much greater extent than even a generation ago. I think that we are able to discuss this today in the current scenario in itself is a great thing. We need to realize that every constitution institutionalizes the judiciary as a principal instrumentality for enforcement of human rights, especially when invaded by the state or other mafia masked in myriad forms. The very oath a judge takes obligates him to uphold justice, tuned to human rights, free from fear or favor, affection, or ill will. It's nothing new that I'm stating. But what is justice? Justice, in my opinion, is what justice does. The most vulnerable victims of injustice must claim our attention first. What is of great moment when we consider human rights is the helpless plight of persons either in custody or, for that matter, especially when we talk of vulnerable groups, then women. The health of any justice system is vital because a right which is not coupled with a realizable remedy is important and has only paper existence. So this statement is very important because we talk of a remedy which is realizable. Quite interestingly, though, especially in the Indian context, we have so many laws. And perhaps if you go through the laws, you'd be like, if properly implemented, chances of conviction are indeed very high. That the chances of these perpetrators going scot-free is very less. But again, I see it as something which remains merely on paper. So when we talk of rape victims, especially, with due apologies to everybody, this might sound very degrading, but I say we treat the victims of sexual abuses and violence as humans without rights at all. I think, and all of us realize, that even the courts, while deciding matters of sexual violence, uh, you know, uh, have at times skipped many important things. And then we have the Mathura rape example, where after a massive outrage was what we witnessed, and a movement against rape and for rape laws emerged. History in India, we see, has left behind social tension, masculinization, lumpinization of society, and crime against vulnerable groups. Vulnerable groups, again, whenever I use these vulnerable groups for the purposes of this discussion, it is limited to women. We must realize that. So women are the primary victims, and crimes against women are on the rise. Among all forms of crimes against women, the crime of sexual violence is one of the most major issues in India. It is estimated that some 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner at some point in their lives. And this is a statistics which is given to us uh, by the United Nations in a report published in the year 2016. Official statistics by the National Crime Records Bureau, which was published in 2009, uh, and then thereafter, report of the Committee on Crime Statistics, which comes under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementations. Reports in the press and so on clearly reflect that sexual violence against women is on a constant increase despite major amendments. Major amendments, especially the 2013 amendment, is what we need to look at. By which laws were brought in. Recent reports have also shown that not only is the crime on the rise, but the gravity and brutality have also crossed all the limits of inhumanity. It is behind, it is behind being realized that technicality and complexity in laws have often led to a miscarriage of justice in the hands of law enforcement authorities, including the judiciary itself, as I had said, and police and lawyers too are a part of it. There have been cases when the accused has gone scot-free because the victim either did not file a complaint in time or because the evidence that was collected was so poor that conviction could not have been ensured. Or for that matter, the police conducted the investigation in such a shoddy manner as to not have gathered sufficient evidence. Or for that matter, at times, what is most exploited by lawyers is the lacuna in the law. So all of these things tend to make it a very complex issue, a very sensitive issue also. What is sexual violence is therefore important. Sexual violence is very often interchangeably used with sexual assault and rape, of course, in general parlance. I think we'll get into the definition of rape, especially in the next session when and at whatever time we have it, and whenever the organizers feel that we can have it. Today is basically a brief overview of the entire thing. So I'd request you to kindly bear with me. Now, the legal meaning as well as the legal implication of sexual violence, assault, and rape, they differ from everyday language due to difference of elements and ingredients attached to them, and how the criminal law defines it for them. Out of all terms, sexual violence is the broadest. We need to bear this in mind for the purposes of this discussion. It refers to a group of crimes including sexual harassment, sexual assault. It can also include incest. It does include sexual abuse, molestation, rape, and so on. Many theorists suggest that a number of factors contribute to sexual violence. But then again, this is important that modern feminists and activists, especially in the Indian scenario, draw a connection between sexual violence and patriarchy. Can't be denied, actually. This is true. So much of the usage of language or the way in which things are looked at, the perspective, they all depend upon the construct of language, and language, as we know, has had a patriarchal construct. I mean, this is important, and we shall also consider this. The deep-rooted patriarchy of Indian society has been exposed. I mean, I'm very certain not many people will deny it. When several people, including very senior politicians, we have several examples, typecast victims of sexual violence. We have a famous leader stating कि लड़के हैं क्या हुआ गलती हो जाती है, and things like that. And these statements, these typecast of victims, contribute to the perpetration of the crime further. There is a belief that sexual violence is a result of irresistible sexual impulses. This is what these people feel. And such kinds of myth continue to dominate the thinking of the majority of the society. Unfortunately, that is true. According to it, men have difficulties in controlling themselves. Therefore, it shall be the responsibility of the women to avoid provoking rape. That is to say, they must avoid dressing provocatively, acting in a promiscuous manner, should not go out in public during late or evening uh, or night, and so on. So, these are things that we need to consider. We need to reflect as to whether it has ever happened to us, and to how many of us has it happened. That while our parents have told the girls to not step out beyond sunset, or maybe still, I mean, sometimes still later, and have told them do not get out late at night, have they also said the same things, and have they had these words of caution for their male child? Or have they ever told their sons that you need to respect women just as much as you respect men? I mean, we see, there is a bias against male, especially in the Indian subcontinent. India is no exception. Male child is what people want. And these are the small things that go on to result into, that see a culmination in these kind of stuff, which we may term as sexual violence, sexual assault. Uh, Now, after the 2012 incident of the, Nirbhaya gang rape incident, we had sudden changes in the criminal law. Sudden changes in the criminal law. But what happened? Have we been able to stop the commission of crimes, or have we been able to even reduce it? The recent story, which everyone must be aware of, is the Hathras incident and the kind of political upheaval that resulted thereafter. So, sometime back, I mean, very recently, when most of the media channels were called to be spineless, suddenly gathered spine to cover the Hathras gang rape incident, and again went on to be spineless. uh, we should also be considering during the course of our further discussions the rulings of the Supreme Court of India as regards rape matters. An important thing that we shall also be considering will be the sexual harassment of women at workplace, which was the outcome of the Vishakha case. And then again, sexual harassment in the Supreme Court premises itself. Uh, I'm very certain. I'm very certain all of you remember the very recent incident of what happened with Justice Ranjan Gogoi and the allegations leveled against him and how that matter was handled. Does that also bespeak of patriarchy? Or for that matter, uh, in an institutional setup, anything can happen? So these are the two angles from which we shall look into the matter. We shall also be talking about consent as a ground of refusal for conviction in rape cases. So basically, resistance, whenever we talk of resistance in matters of rape, it establishes two elements of crime: force and non consent. And these are the things that we shall delve into in more detail in the times to come. We shall be talking about errors in age verification, how that is done, and how the liability then is ascertained after verification of age has been done. What is the relevance of the testimony of the prosecutrix herself? We shall be talking about the identity of the prosecutrix and the accused, the way evidence has to be collected. Then we shall also be talking about the medical test for the purposes of evidence collection and how degrading it can be. With the medical practitioners insisting on the two-finger test. We shall also be talking about recalling victims and witnesses and of the presumption which is under Section 114 of the Indian Evidence Act. What what are the impacts or effects of having an FIR registered with delay in matters of rape? Can there also be compromises in matters of rape? Because this is something that I saw here while practicing, that many people arrive at compromises, especially in matters of rape and murder. I mean, offenses which are not compoundable at all. But yes, that happens. That's a reality. We shall also be talking about the medical legal assistance which is given to victims or to survivors of sexual violence. Absolutely in tatters in India. We shall be talking about the guidelines and protocols for victims of sexual violence, the guidelines that have been framed by the judiciary itself. We shall be talking about the psychological support for women survivors of sexual assault, guidelines and protocols by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Perhaps I'll also be circulating certain things for the purposes of preparation of a repository with law essentials. And then we'll talk about vulnerability as a factor. But before I talk of vulnerability and secondary victimization, I'll just, bring out something which I've often been baffled with. During the course of my practice, I've also come across many matters wherein there were two people, young people, beautiful people who were in love with each other, some 16-year-old boys and girls. And while these were in love with each other, they attempted an exploration of each other and in absolute purity of form and love. What happens is that the girl's father comes to know of all of these things and then goes to the police station, lodges an FIR. POXO is invoked, provisions of POXO are invoked, and the boy is charged under POXO. The boy's parents, too, therefore, only for the purposes of having a counter case, go to the police station, they refuse a registration of FIR. What needs to be considered, for the time being, please overlook the categorization in the Juvenile Justice Act of 16 to 18 years. But what we at present will be looking at, and please consider this, think over this. What happens is that a boy below the age of 18 years, or for that matter who is age 16, is not mature enough to even contract and is not mature enough to take decisions for his own self. How then is that boy mature enough to have willfully assaulted the lady, the girl, the 16-year-old girl, sexually? This is what we need to consider. And why was it that whenever the boy's parents visited the police station, the police refused registration of FIR? So basically, even in matters like this, we see there is a prejudice, a deep-rooted prejudice which exists. And it is because of such prejudice that we see rape in a particular way, that we see victims of rape in a particular way. So there's also something very important, and that is the secondary victimization of rape victims. It happens, of course, in other, it happens with other victims as well. But for rape victims are disowned by the society, by the family. Questions are raised on the way a rape victim dresses up. But does that really matter? There are immensely associated, psychological trauma with this kind of secondary victimization. And all of these things we shall consider, including the procedural aspect when it comes to rape matters in India, and how the very functioning of the courts is what, in my personal opinion, is a violation of the human rights of victims of rape. Thank you so much. I think that was an introduction that I've given. Hopefully, we shall proceed with it as and when Law Essential deems fit.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it was a very insightful session, and many of us have got an in-depth idea, at least a gist of what it is all about. We have a few questions coming in from the audience, if we can take them up, sir.
Most certainly, please.
First question coming in from Shravya. Sir, do you think life imprisonment or a death penalty for the offenses of rape and not murder would reduce the number of rape cases?
In my personal opinion, life imprisonment or death penalty, or even a 3 years imprisonment, or for that matter, castration. You see, I'm talking of a wide range of punishments. These will have absolutely no impact on the number of rape cases per se, unless we have an effective mechanism and a justice administration system wherein we see that proper investigations are conducted, proper trials are conducted, and at the end, a proper conviction is handed over to the accused persons. The mere fear of being in prison for a period of 1 year would be sufficient to stop all of these things, given that we can boast of a robust justice administration system. So, for instance, if X commits an offense, even if it be theft, and he knows or she knows that the person is going to be caught and soon shall land up behind the bars, that person shall certainly be much more conscious about performing such an act. Sentences, the the duration or the gravity of the sentences do not generally matter.
Thank you, sir. The next question coming in from Anu Sharma. Sir, don't you think the media also has also plays a responsible part in these kind of activities with respect to the rape cases?
I think I'd like to answer this question. Uh, I mean, being slightly autobiographical. So before I landed up for the actual court practices, I was like what they show in the television media and movies is something far, far detached from the reality. Having come to the court, especially in trial courts, where I practiced for some 2.5 years, I realized that things can turn out to be far more dramatic than they are shown in the movies. So, I mean, unless something is a science fiction, everything else seems plausible. So, I do not see the media per se is not a reflection of society. I see it as a reflection of what is happening in society. But yes, the media certainly do have the media certainly do have a great impact on so many things, be it dressing, be it food style, be it living style, lifestyle, and things like that. And hence, even uh, on criminals. So therefore, many of the crime scenes or crime thrillers that are available for public viewing have an impact on many people. Many people tend to emulate these things. I mean, just as a child learns by looking at things, the fashion industry is one of the greatest examples. So you see, I mean, let us consider how fashion suddenly boomed in India, and television media played a very important role in this.
Thank you so much, sir. We have the next question from Meher. We have sufficient laws against any crime in India, but to make the law applicable is a major part of it. What is the reason behind the disinterest in the execution of laws in our country?
Uh, we have sufficient laws against any crime in India, but to make that law applicable plays a major role. What is the reason where? All right. Uh, Basically, we are getting into the justice administration system. Why are laws not properly implemented? Now, there are many factors why laws are not properly implemented. Greed is one of the greatest factors. The second is, uh, states not having taken up the responsibility to see to it that laws are enforced. Now, why do I say greed? I do not know if it would be appropriate to say this, but then I can talk about a recent sting operation that happened in the year 2018, if I'm not wrong, in a civil court in Patna, wherein it was showed that even for the purposes of having a date fixed for the matter to be taken up, 20, 30 rupees were demanded by the bench clerk. And all of this while the magistrate or the judge concerned was seated on the uh, was seated on the chair, and all of this happened in front of him, before him. So I will look at it from this. I mean top to bottom approach. I'll have a top to bottom approach. So the magistrate or the judge concerned is seated. The lawyers go and pay to this bench clerk some money for the purposes of having a date for the matter to be listed on a particular date. When the magistrate or the judge himself, who is supposed to be upright and honest, does not ensure does not ensure that there is no corruption within his own court premises, how can we expect that bench clerk to be not, emboldened and to not seek money for the purposes of even giving a date, assigning a date? What happens with the police? Police, again, in India is very meagerly paid. We have to accept this. The kind of responsibility that they shoulder is immense. So we have, in India, law keeping, law enforcement, patrolling, etc. All of these duties are conferred on a single force. So the way they operate makes it very hectic for them. And then again, with the kind of paychecks that they receive, it tends to corrupt them to a very great extent. Additionally, uh, general citizens are also responsible for that. Lawyers too, of course. Why? Because you ask a client who comes to you, are you willing? These are practical difficulties that I'm talking to you about. Because I've not had a very long duration of practice, but when I came into practice, I was absolutely new, and I realized that my clients were at times willing to pay to the police for the purposes of having the investigation manipulated far more than they would be willing to pay me for the purposes of arguments before courts of law. So in India, we have this tendency of having things done either by hook or by crook. And again, why do lawyers therefore? Many lawyers therefore not remain honest, and they resort to several practices which are absolutely unbecoming of a lawyer. And that happens because even a young man who comes fresh from the law school and commences in his practice, it does not matter how bright that young man is, will never be looked upon with the kind of respect that he should be given. In fact, seniors for that matter, while of course I do not say that this is a blanket case, but then many seniors say the very fact that you worked with me is good enough, an experience for you. I'm not going to pay you enough. How does that young man or woman who suddenly jumps into jumps and joins the bar survive? How does that person do that? So there are many things, many factors. All of these are interrelated. You cannot really separate one from the other. It's how the society is working. So, for instance, people who are very self-righteous, who take a moral high ground, and this happened. This came to my mind, especially when the Anna movement was taking place, and I'd written a piece back then. Uh, so there was this uproar. Everybody wanted, that we have a lokpal, we'll set it up. Even MPs would come under that, judges would come under that. But then I had a question. Why was that selective outrage there? People who were part of that movement forgot that at some point or the other, they have not just bribed somebody, but even for the purposes of purchasing land, they paid some money over and above the circle rate to the person who was selling it. And the circle rate was paid in check, while the remaining portion was paid in cash. Almost everybody has been corrupt or has been indulged, has indulged in corrupt practices. So this can happen only if we have a good education system, only if what we are taught at law schools, that there's something called justice, and we are able to ensure that we facilitate the ends of justice in the courts of law. I told you right in the very beginning of my opening remarks that at the end of 1 week I was left so dejected. I saw there was nothing called justice; only matters were being decided by the courts. An incident happened when a learned additional district judge said to me when I referred to some three judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court. He said, "यहाँ कोई Supreme Court का judgment नहीं चलता है." That is what happened to me. So these are the realities. We will have to, of course, struggle, and we need to respect everybody. It is only then that things might improve. Can't have a straight answer to this.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. So the next question coming in from Pushpak Kumar. Can you differentiate between the personal rights and the human rights of the rape victim?
All right. Personal rights and human rights. Now, personal rights would fall within the domain of human rights. You know, I would just tell you one thing. We've been taught at law school. My right ends where your nose begins. Uh, I think that should be good enough. That should be good enough to tell you how we can manage the rights of individuals. Uh, and of course, again, of the society at large. What is important when we talk about all of these things is that yes, what is important when we talk about all of these things is that we need to consider and we need to be very, very certain that an individual has certain rights. Now, these rights, all of these rights are human rights. Personal rights, I do not understand what you mean by personal rights, but I'll take it to mean that you are talking about fundamental rights. So it's necessary that all rights might not necessarily be fundamental rights, but all rights which an individual has is certainly going to be a human right. Human right would also mean that the interface between two persons uh, do not stand just opposite each other. Now, in the simplest terms, if I were to say that to you, human rights arise simply by being a human. Personal rights, on the other hand, arise by the the virtue of certain rights being conferred upon you either by a statute or by a constitution, and are more rooted in legislation. That is how I would see it.
The next question from Varsha Kumari. Should there be timelines in the trials of a rape case?
Oh, yes, I wish there was. Timelines would ensure that we had speedy justice. But merely having timelines would serve no purpose if we do not have a good investigating agency and good set of people at the law courts.
How does the financial status of the rapist create a hindrance for the human rights of a rape victim?
This is again an important question, and it comes, I mean, answer to this comes from an experience. Just last year, a girl aged 16 was gang raped. And while, of course, I was practicing in the High Court, I was requested to take up this matter. And I realized that the victim's family was very, very, very poor. They could have barely afforded money for food. And during the course of the investigation, I mean, even I had the opportunity to speak to two eyewitnesses. But I mean, I was so surprised when these two eyewitnesses refused to depose before courts of law, before the court, stating that दूसरे तरफ के लोग तो बहुत पैसे वाले हैं, वो हमें छोड़ेंगे नहीं. So I think that statement itself bespeaks of how money and power matter, and how it is always difficult for a person who is very weak, especially financially, to even afford a good justice. I mean, perhaps if these people had money, they could have even given money to the police, and the police would have done a wonderful investigation. You'd be surprised to know that even the blood samples and viscera, all of which were collected, were sent for forensic investigation examination almost after a lapse of 1 year or more. So it serves no purpose, right? To be to be financially weak is the worst thing you can expect in India. I mean, let's leave rape victims. Let's talk of normal matters, matters on civil side or service matters. How many of us can afford to engage a great top-notch lawyer at the Supreme Court of India? Uh, Many of them are beyond our abilities uh, and our reaches, right? So it's not just specific to rape victims, it is for everybody.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. The next question from Jyoti. Can you talk about the status of marital rape and how it violates fundamental rights?
Status of marital rape. Well, marital rape per se has not been decriminalized in India. The judgment that was rendered by Justice Madan Lokur and his brother judge was on a slightly different footing. Marital rape, in effect, of course, it has been, I mean, you have an intercourse with anybody who is below the age of 18 would necessarily become rape. I mean, there is nothing called marital rape, uh, exemption in India as of yet. But in my personal opinion, it's a very progressive jurisprudence which has been adopted at most places. Because in a marriage, we need to realize and understand that while two people agree to be together, that relationship is based on respect and cannot be a relationship wherein one person believes the other to be an object of prurient interest or pleasure. Uh, I think the discussions on marital rape therefore focus on all of these things. In fact, for that matter, the uh, striking down of the uh, law on adultery was also a very welcome step. Because there are many things in a marriage, just apart from what I bluntly say, sex. So I think it is a progressive step that must be taken forth, and explicitly there should be something called marital rape exemption having struck down in India. That was not done when Justice Madan Lokur pronounced his judgment with his brother judge. That must be done.
So, what is your stance or the viewpoint about acid attack cases, sir?
Will acid attacks stop if you stop selling acids? Well, if you don't have anything, of course, I do not see how acid attacks would take place. But again, man is the basis of all animals, and man is also the best of all animals. That is what I read somewhere. Uh, much of what we see translate as crime comes from the kind of society we've been brought up into, comes from the kind of upbringing that we've had. So I've seen many matters. I've seen matters of, slightly diverging from the acid attacks. To give you another example, uh, I've seen a very beautiful lady married to a man, and I've been told that the man considers her to be a trophy. And I feel that, all right, it's okay if he considers her to be trophy only to the extent that he is using the phrase to say that, look, she is my pride and she is a symbol of my worthiness. But that is not what he means by that. This man says, you're beautiful and you have to do everything just as I say, and I cannot let you out, and I cannot let anybody else see you, and I cannot let you befriend anybody. So you see all of these things. Where do these things come from? I think he's been possessive. But then he's invading into the private space of that wonderful lady and is only making her life more difficult to lead. So we see all of these things, and I'll tell you, much of these things are also propagated by the Bollywood, right? So someday you'll see an Ashok come over, and he'll suddenly cut his wrist, and then the girl will say, "Oh no, 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 I'll live with you." So these are things that basically reflect of the kind of people we are as a society, wherein we want something either by hook or by crook, and we are very possessive about things. So I would say being possessive of a human being is just as good as being materialistic. And most of the acid attacks, what we see, uh, they take place only because the girl has either refused to be in a relationship with a man, and the man says, "No, you are so beautiful that if you're not with me, you can't be with anybody." Or in some of the cases, whenever there is some kind of enmity or things like that. But then the first is, uh, generally the case. So this reflects of how we treat women per se. We treat women as commodities. We treat women as materials. We as a society, I mean. And this can be undone only after everybody has unlearned so many things that they've been fed into. It's going to take some time.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to take the last question of this very insightful morning. What are the penal provisions for victims on country's border or in police lockup?
Penal provisions for victims on countries' borders or in police locker cases. I could not get this question very clearly. If you could
I think
elaborate
it's
on.
about rape cases in the countries occurring in the country's border or inside the police lockup.
Okay, rape cases occurring inside the police lockup. It's, mm, it's. These things are, of course, not new to us. Several provisions. Parts of 376 do deal with these cases. They do deal with all of these cases. I think we shall be discussing all of these in details. I think, if this is what has been explained by Farhan, it refers to uh, uh, commission of an act by a police officer while on duty or by a public servant while on duty. So that is well contained, of course, in uh, under section 375, 376 and related provisions. we shall discuss it hopefully in the next session, because I'll be delving into the essential ingredients of the offense of rape, into other varied forms of sexual violence. We'll also be getting into the procedural aspects of it. It is another matter that, existence of laws do not matter as much matters the implementation. So we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this most certainly, but in the next session. Hopefully you attend it, and we'll talk about it in detail.
Thank you so much, sir. I think with this we come to the end of the session. It has been a really insightful session, and the audience have loved you throughout the course of the session. Thank you so much for joining with us today, sir. It's been a pleasure to host this event.
Thank you so much. The next time I join, I shall have to check beforehand that my camera and mic works. And I'd request you, therefore, to kindly have the next session on Zoom, because that's far more easy, I guess. And we can. I mean, that would also afford me an opportunity to interact with the audience live. That's
Surely,
more
sir.
important.
I think we can schedule a session on the same topic as a continuation of this topic in the next week, and that can be on Zoom, sir.
Oh yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.